Hello, thanks for joining me again today. We are going to do more water reflections today, but a zoomed in version of the painting we did in the water reflections video number 1. So this is number 2, doing a zoomed in version. We're going to add a little bit more elements. We did lily pads with trees in the background in that first video. So today we're just going to focus on the lily pads, and we're going to add some flowers and maybe get a little crazy with our colors. We're also going to, pencil and pen are going to be very prominent in this painting. So getting a little bit more obvious that we're working with mixed media. Okay, so we start with our clean paper, dry, since we're going to draw first. And I have a couple of lily pad photographs sort of off to the side to help me with to get things a little bit more accurate. Since we are zoomed in, we want to get things to look semi-realistic, and then we can start to get abstract when we start putting in colors. So now I'm just going to lay out where my lily pads are going to go. Make sure you have varying sizes of these, that they overlap a bit to create some visual interest. And I'm also going to, since we can see through the water just a little bit, or our watercolor will be transparent enough that we should be able to see some of the little stems coming up from the water. So make sure to incorporate those. I'm also we're going to have our little flowers here. And my sketch is probably not going to be as accurate as they could be, but we'll combat that once we come back with our pen. I just want to know exactly where these flowers will go at this point. Maybe we have some lily pads that are sort of lifting out of the water a little. Maybe we have some flowers that are poking up but haven't quite started to bloom yet. And all while you're doing this, just think about your composition. I think mine's going to be a little heavy in this lower right corner, and then I'll have more evidence of the reflections off the water in this corner. Add another flower off to the side here. And then our lily pads are just going to get a little bit smaller as they start to get farther away from us. And just more of flower bulbs popping up. And then maybe I'll have one more flower here. Okay, And then I'm going to draw in a couple of like water ripples on the edges of our little bunch of lily pads here. And then since we're so zoomed in on this little bunch of lily pads, we're not going to see the trees in the background, but we can see some of their reflections. So this space will be reserved for those tree reflections. Okay. All right, so I'm going to keep a lot of these pencil lines. Again, since we're working with mixed media here, I do want some of this pencil to show up through our watercolor. So I'll maybe make some of the lily pads that are closest to us, I'll make those a little bit darker so they'll feel like they're closer. And the lily pads back here, I'll just leave alone. So here you can already see that lines are darker. As they start to recede, they get lighter. All right, so I'm going to start with my number 12 paintbrush. And I'm going to paint in the water. And with these close-ups, you can get a little bit more playful with your color. So I think for me, I'm going to go with water that leans a little bit more purple. And that'll be a good contrast when we bring in the reflections of the green trees in the background. Having a purple backdrop for those would be a little bit more interesting. So I've got my purple mixed up, but before I put that color down, I'm going to wet the background here so that the water color can flow around a little bit, can just do what water does. And we might get some cool textures back here. Okay, and now I have my color, my purple. It's still reading a little bit blue, but just has that just slight redness to it. Now I'm just going to work in sort of long horizontal stripes, but because we wet our page beforehand, it's not going to be clear stripes, but it's going to lend to the horizontal nature of water movement, at least on the surface. And then I'm going to bring that color down into the ripples of the water, but leaving a lot of white space down here, since those water ripples will have a highlight. Okay, and then once the water gets closer to the viewer, I'm going to make the water a more of a bluish green color. And that way, when I start putting down the sort of yellowish green for the lily pads, there'll be some contrast here next to the water. And you can do this with a smaller paintbrush if you want to. With the rounded brush, it really comes to a point. So you can get into tight spaces even with a larger brush. All right, so I'm just going to fill in these gaps with this new watercolor. get it, watercolor. And then I'm going to pull this color into the ripples just a little bit and maybe just a touch of it up here. Okay, so I'm going to bring this color up into the main water just a little bit. But again, we're going to save a lot of this space for the reflections of our trees. Like that. Okay, so I still have some green on my palette, but I'm going to mix a bit more yellow into it. We do want the green that we use for the trees to be a bit different from the green that we're doing on our lily pads, just to create some depth. So the green that I'm going to use down here is going to be a very bright, vibrant, sort of like the tape that I have here. So the green that I'm using for the trees is going to look a little bit more evergreen, just darker. And to do that, you just add either red or burnt sienna or both to your green color just to make it a little bit darker. And even in the background here, we need a couple of varieties of green. So I'm just going to pull down with this color in a couple places, and then we can mix another green and pull that color down. So I'm going to add a little bit more red to my green. It starts to look a little bit brown, but it's still in a greenish family. So just create a couple of different shades of green for the reflections here. All right, I'm going to rinse my paintbrush off so I have just clear water. And then I'm going to make a couple of just back and forth brush strokes just so that those colors start to zigzag a little bit. Some of those greens can be then pulled down even farther, and they could start to flow into our water ripples. I'm going to bring some of these greens down very intentionally into the water ripples, but leaving the white of the paper that we've left alone, sort of paint in between those white stripes, just that we don't lose those highlights. And just do this in a couple of places. You don't have to do a lot of them to get that sense of a reflection. And it is good to have a variety of tones back here, so it gets darker over here, and then we have a darker area here. So maybe these are trees that are closer to our bunch of lily pads here than the trees in between. So yeah, just make sure you have a variety. And the more scattered things look, like the more natural those reflections will start to feel. Okay, so I'm going to leave that area alone right now to dry. We can come back, see if we want to do anything else to that. But that's basically going to be the simplest part of our painting, is that, or those reflections back here. We're going to get very detailed when we get up here. So I was using my size 12. I'm going to switch over to my size 10, just so it's a little bit smaller for these lily pads. And I think I've said in the past, the human eye is trained to see every single shade of green imaginable. So what will make this look very natural is to have multiple shades of green. But I think the easiest way to do that for me is go ahead and put a base coat on all these lily pads of the same green, or slightly, you can change it up a little bit, and then we'll just start dropping other colors into them. So maybe this one has a little bit more red, this one has a little bit more blue in it, but I think it's easiest for me to just put down a base coat, and then we can change the greens from there. And watercolor really allows you to do that, since it will stay wet for quite a while. Quite a while meaning probably 5-minute tops. If you want additional colors to drop into your base coat to spread, I wouldn't wait longer than 5 minutes. Okay, so I want to do a really bright yellowish green for the lily pads. So I'm starting with green, and then I'm just going to add a bunch of yellow until I get the color I'm looking for. Okay, I think this is what I'm going for. So I'm going to start with in the back here. I'm going to leave just the tiniest white border around the lily pad, just because there is going to be some light hitting it. So I want to leave a tiny, tiny, tiny border, which we can make a color at a later point, but for right now I just want to leave space for some sort of highlight. And as you're doing this process, you'll see where you want to put a darker green because of cast shadows from the flowers or cast shadows from overlapping lily pads. But I just want to focus now on getting this color down, and then we can do the shadows. But always keep in mind while you're putting these mid-tone colors down to leave a little space for a little bit of highlight. And we'll also have some shadows on the water itself because these lily pads are casting a shadow onto the water too. And to paint this the way that I've just sort of laid out, of putting a base color and then dropping in color to make different shades of green, you do have to work kind of fast. So if you don't want to work this fast, then I would just suggest mixing up a new green every time and then paint each lily pad a new green color. Because depending on how fast you're painting, this first one you painted could already, theoretically, could already be dry by now. Depending on how fast you're going. So if you want to relieve some pressure off of your speed, just mix different greens as you're going along. Okay, so I have my green colors down. I'm going to drop in some blue on the ones that are farther away. That should make it look like they're blending in with the water underneath them a little bit more than the ones that are up close. And you can always drop in clear water to help these colors blend into the green underneath them. I'm going to mix up a purple to drop into a couple of these. Maybe the flowers are purple, so some of that color is going to be reflected onto the lily pad. Because that's another thing too. These lily pads sometimes have water on top of them, so the lily pads can be reflecting the light around them just as much as the water. All right. So I think I've done enough purple. I maybe want to do more red. On the ones closest. And you can see just adding this little bit of color has really added some dimension to these leaves or these lily pads. All right, and then maybe the ones closest to us, just get a little orange. Maybe this flower is orange, so it's reflecting orange onto this lily pad, and the one next to it. And then just coming in with clear water to really help blend that color into the green. Okay. So since we've already sort of decided what colors these flowers are going to be, I'm going to use that same orange I used to put into the lily pads and put it into my really rough, I have really rough sketches of these flowers. So we'll come back with our micron pins or unipins or whatever brand you have. We'll come back in and reinforce those flowers. But here's my orange one. I'm going to do like a pink one in the center here. And then maybe the third one starts to feel a little more purple. And then these flowers that have popped up but haven't bloomed yet. I think the images that I've researched, those bulbs still have a green outer layer. So I'm just going to come in with one of my greens that I have here and just sort of drop in some of that. And then we'll come back and paint in those stems as well. Okay, I'm gonna switch to a much smaller brush to paint these little stems. This is a number 3. And just paint those coming down. I'm also going to paint the little stems that are under the water that are holding these lily pads up. I want to paint those in as well. Just so that we can start to imagine the life underneath the water. Okay, so what I want to do now is take that watercolor that we created for the water deep down here. I'm going to mix a little bit of purple into it, and then I'm going to create a little cast shadow that the lily pad is casting onto the water below it. This water should be dry enough for you to be able to get pretty clear shadows. All right, like that. All right, and then with this smaller brush, I'm just gonna come in and make, like every lily pad has a bit of a white border around it, which is, again, we wanted to leave that for highlights. But now with this smaller brush, we can just come in and make those little white borders really, really thin. And maybe at the bottom of the lily pad, that highlight goes away. Since now we're sort of turned away from the sun on this side. And just make sure you're rinsing your brush off quite a lot during this process, just so that you don't blend things that you don't want blended. All right. Just have a quick feel up here to see how wet things are. They're still a little wet. Okay, I'm gonna mix some yellow. Again, just sticking with my small brush. I think I want to use my small brush from here on out because everything is getting really detailed. I'm going to put some yellow into the center of my flowers. And then on our bulbs here, I want this yellow to sort of act as the highlight on these. Maybe this one is like about to bloom and it's opening up a little bit. So I'm going to add some color there. Okay, so some of this water down here, I want it to be darker. Again, I don't think the contrast between like this little stem that's holding up this lily pad and the water should be as strong as it is right now. So I'm going to come in with that shadow color that I used for the shadows of the lily pads and just make the water a teeny bit darker down here. Okay, so I think that feels a little bit better. And at this stage, if you see things that are blending that you don't want to blend so much, like I have this, the color of the little unopened bulb here is bleeding into the lily pad behind it. Just come in with a Q-tip or a Kleenex and you can pick up some of that pigment. All right, and since this is somewhat dry up here, I'm going to go back to my size 10. And I want to make some texture back here that makes it a little bit more obvious that these are trees. So always remember, since you're upside down now, you're doing the reflection of a tree, that you're, the directions of your leaves have to show that it's a little upside down. So I'm coming in with this green color, making a little upside down tree shape. Anywhere that you do have white on your paper, just leave that alone. That's going to help with the reflection illusion. The little spaces that you leave white. So there's a little upside down tree, but it's not as, it should be a little bit more distorted. So I'm going to come in with clear water and just sort of push some of that color around so that it doesn't look like we just painted a upside down tree there. I'm going to do the same right next to it, but I'm going to change my color to a bit more darker green. Like almost a brown, but not quite. And then just change the kind of brush strokes you were making. So maybe here I'm just going to do really long brush strokes. Again, there's a trunk of the tree here that we're gonna build off of. Just so that we have a variety of mark making here. I'm gonna do this tree differently than the one before. Don't get too heavy with it. And then again with clear water, just gonna come back and blur some of that into the background. Leaving some spaces sort of really sharp and you can see those brush strokes. And then other places I want it to just all blur together. And then over here, maybe we have a tree with a bunch of red leaves. So I'm just gonna drop in some red. And then again with clear water, blend that in just a touch. I want to bring some of that red into the ripples down here. And then over here we have a tree that I'm going to build off of what we have here. Maybe this is a tree that doesn't have any leaves on it. So I just want to sort of show off where those limbs are going off in different directions. And then with clear water, make it a little bit wobbly since reflections are, and we're just coming off of our ripples here. So we don't want a straight limb coming off of this tree. We want it to be kind of distorted. Maybe this tree is super tall and it reaches all the way down to our lily pads here. Making sure we're not covering up our ripples. But that tree maybe is arching over our water here. So we want those tree limbs to be reflected all the way out here. All right. Okay, so I think for now I want to let this dry before I do anything else. Because the next, I think I want a couple more layers of watercolor on top of our lily pads, and then we'll want to let it dry, and then we'll come back in with our marker and really emphasize some of these shapes. Okay, and we're back. I let this dry for a couple hours at this point. So what I want to do before we do another layer of watercolor, because we are completely dry right now, this is when you want to go in with your pen. You can still draw with your pen when your paper is wet, but it might bleed a little bit. It also might dilute the ink. So instead of getting a pure black line, it might start to dilute to a gray. So that's just my tip. draw when your paper is dry. So what I want to do here is I'm going to do most of my line work down here so that this remains our focus. And because this is reflections, there's not going to be a lot of pin work up here, maybe a couple of ripple lines all the way back here, but that's about it. So I'm going to come in, and it's really up to you where you want to draw these lines. And this is going to take some practice to learn exactly how you like to draw on top of your watercolor. I would caution though, this does not come back up. So wherever you draw those lines, they're going to stay there. So if you've come this far and you like what you've got already and you don't want to do pin, don't worry about it. You don't have to. You've got some of your pencil back there, which makes this painting a mixed media painting. This just makes it a little bit more obvious. But if you just like the watercolor and you want to keep that, go for it. I just want a little bit more of a graphic feel to this. That's why I'm going in with my pen. So I'm going to outline all of my flowers, just because the petals of the flowers were so small that all the color just sort of ran together. So I want to come in with my pen just to outline those petals so that we know that these were flowers. And we will come back on top of this layer of ink with more watercolor. It shouldn't bleed. It's very permanent, so don't worry about what you're drawing now getting diluted later. All right, and then I'll move to this one. All right, and then I'm going to keep doing these bulbs that have sort of risen above the water line that haven't bloomed yet. And these two in the front specifically, I think, need to get outlined because they're the closest thing to the viewer. So I'm going to give these two a little bit more detail. And if you need a photo reference right next to you while you're painting this so that you get all the details accurate, please do so. Or if you want to make them a little bit more abstract and not so realistic, you can just sort of create some of those details yourself. All right, and then I'm going to outline the lily pads as well. If you look at a photo of a lily pad, the edges of the lily pad sort of curve upward all the way around the edges. So how I'm going to show that off is I'm going to do a smooth curved line right at the bottom, and that will be essentially where the lily pad and the water are touching. That creates that sort of smooth line. But with all these curves that pop up in the lily pad, we can just do a lot of irregular sort of up and down, sort of zigzaggy shapes like that. And that will just sort of show off the fact that those edges are curving up. And this pure black is that shadow on that side of the lily pad, since our sun is over here. And some of this shadow can pop up on the top edge of a lily pad as well, again because they're turning up. The sides that are facing away from the sun will have a little bit of shadow on them. But I'm not going to do a full solid line like I did on the bottom, just a couple of little spots on the top side of these lily pads. So I'm going to do that same process for all of them. Here's the point as well where you can, these are circular shapes and they're a leaf, so there is some veining that happen within the lily pad itself, which I think I won't advise to do that with a pin. Those should be a little bit more subtle, so we'll do that veining with a green watercolor once we're done with our pin. All right, so that's mostly what I'm going to do with my pen. Like I said, I might come in here and do a couple of lines in the ripples, but not too much. We want the focus to stay on our lily pads back here. Okay, so what I want to do now is we have a couple more places where some shadows should be popping up. So I'm going to create a shadow color, which I'm going to use sort of the dark green that we had made for the trees back here, but I'm going to add just a little bit of blue to it. Since we have the water down here that's blue, I want the shadows to look similar. Okay. So if we imagine our sun as being at the horizon line behind these plants, these taller buds that haven't started to bloom yet, they're going to be casting a shadow, right? So I'm going to imagine my sun is coming from this corner, and I'm going to draw or paint in my shadows accordingly. So this one is going to be casting a shadow this way. And this one, maybe onto this other lily pad. These flowers are going to be casting a shadow. And they're going to have some shadows in themselves with all these petals. Those petals are going to have shadows. All right, same with this little shadow, this little flower. It's going to be casting a shadow onto this lily pad. Same with this one. And you can make these shadows elongate as much as you want. They can be stretching over this entire lily pad if you want. And then the lily pads themselves, if they're overlapping, if any of them are overlapping on top of a lily pad that's to the left, it'll be casting a little bit of a shadow as well. And then we can even come in and enhance the shadows of the lily pads on the water. Just because some of those might have gotten dulled down. Or not, they don't seem as dark anymore because we put that ink in there. So you can darken those shadows up a little bit. All right, so I'm gonna pick up my smaller brush, my number 3. And like I said before, I'm gonna do some veining in the lily pads themselves. So I'm gonna go back to the green that I used for that base coat for the lily pads, but I'm gonna add a little bit of burnt sienna and just a touch of red. That was more than a touch. Drop some more green in there. We just want that green to be darker, a little bit darker than the green we have down there already. And I want it to be in the same sort of green family, so I still want it to be very yellow, but just darker. All right, so what I'm going to do here is each one of these little bumps that we made around the edges of the lily pads, I'm going to just sort of cast a shadow off the side of each one of those bumps that isn't facing the sun over here. So for some of those bumps, it's going to be to the right side of the bump, and then for some it'll be the left just because since these are circular objects, the sides that are hitting the sun are different as you go around. So that's how I would sort of approach the veining in these lily pads. Just start from the edge and come in. And the sides where you don't have a lot of that shadow that we did with the marker, you can just lay those shadows down sort of in the center. Like this, where they're not touching the edge exactly, but you're still showing that there's some veining. And all these lines should head towards the center of the lily pad. It doesn't have to be exact. Okay, I think the last thing I want to attempt to do is put a little bit more greens back here. So I'm not really trying to mimic the shape of trees or anything. Just coming in with horizontal strokes just to bring a little bit more green into the background here. I'll probably do the same with a blue just to reinforce the fact that there's water back here. But I think anytime you're doing a reflection, if you have sort of this undulation between a dark color and then a really faded section where you see a lot of the paper through it, that's just going to help with the reflection illusion. So I just want to help that along by putting in some sections that are a little bit darker, and that will just help make this feel like it's reflecting something dark above it. And we can also make our corners a little bit darker than everything else. That'll help lead your eye to the center of the page. And then where I drew these ink lines for where the ripples of the water are extending past, those can get a little bit more color next to them so that they have some more dimension. But everything I'm drawing out here isn't a flat horizontal. I'm still adhering to this slight curve where my ripples are. So just make sure you keep doing that. And then if you notice there are any sections that maybe have too much white of the paper showing through, you can come in with some of that watercolor, the color of the water, and fill in some of those spaces. Okay, so I think that is a good stopping point for me. That's about as detailed as I want to get down here. And I think there's enough colors up here where we can really tell that we're looking at reflections of different kinds of trees. So just let this dry before you untape it, and then you're good to go. Thank you so much for joining me for this Water Reflections #2 video.